Hello and welcome to PowerShell Writing Functions. My name is Brian Kafferkey. The content for this presentation is available on github.com at bkafferkey/shared, and it's under PowerShell Functions, so you can get the code, etc. So feel free to go for that. Let's jump right in. And by the way, the capitalist angle I must promote here is I do have a book out on PowerShell, and it was really a labor of love, but talked about in my other videos, but it does have a lot of in-depth scripts, a lot of advanced concepts and things, and I even have it here. So I use it myself because I forget half of what I know about PowerShell all the time. So I can go back there and say, oh wow, that's how I do that. So yeah, I even have to fall back on things like that. So let me jump in. So let's talk about, number one, what are PowerShell functions? And I should mention I'm drinking out of my R mug today, wearing my, I don't know if you can see it, my Python shirt, my Microsoft hat, all branded. So let's start out. So what are PowerShell functions? We'll talk about why we care. So what's so important about functions, how not to write a function, some really bad practices you can do. We'll talk about discoverability and what's in a name, and how to write a function, like I think a good sample function. And we'll talk about like gotchas, advanced features, and kind of demonstrate things. So what are functions? The number one thing about functions you need to take away from this is it's code that can be reused. Once you've written it, you've tested it, it works, you want to wrap it up in a box and just reuse it and never write that code again. That's the number one thing about functions. Now, to make them flexible, most functions have to take parameters, because usually you want to say, maybe you're copying a file or doing something, you want to be able to say what file is it, where is it, or if you're doing something with messages or variables, you want to be able to pass those in. Now, a nice feature with functions is if they can be dynamically loaded. If you think of like dynamic link libraries or load libraries that Microsoft has, for instance, automatic loading. Most languages that have functions have a way to automatically load them, and PowerShell's way is with modules. So if you put your functions in module scripts, you can use the input module function, and PowerShell will automatically locate where they are and load them for you. Another way you can do it is what's called dot sourcing, and I'll talk about that as well. But you want to make sure that you can get them as easily as possible loaded so you can use them. They only execute when called. So one of the things that may be a little confusing to you if you're used to just writing scripts one line at a time and it just runs through, is when you do a function, you're going to wrap it up in a function statement. And that means that it's treating it as a block of code with a name, and it only runs if you call it by name. So it's kind of like a variable. Unless you reference it, it doesn't do anything. In PowerShell, commandlets are really functions. So when you name them, you should name them like commandlets, as we'll talk about, and functions really give you the ability to write your very own commandlets. Many modules you use are actually using PowerShell functions as commandlets. And you can combine, again, with modules to amaze your friends. So why do we care about all this? Well, the number one thing is it speeds up development, so that's important. After a while, you start to build up a library of all these different functions you can use, or you get ones on the internet, GitHub, etc., or from people in your company that have written functions. You don't have to write them, you just use them, so you're speeding up your development. And since they've been tested, they've been used in many places and they work, then you get reliability out of it. Instead of always writing new code that could break for any number of reasons, they can be shared. Collect them, trade with your friends. You can share your functions, especially in modules, with other people, and that is very common to be done, so really good. And in the end, it's going to boost productivity. So you're going to be able to do a lot more with less time, and amaze your boss, get a raise, everything will be good. So reusability is absolutely critical for automation. So it's a really important thing here. I see a lot of people in the world of basically system build automation, that type of thing, and oftentimes they're not used to developing code in a lot of like elaborate code. So whereas developers are used to writing functions and they use it for all kinds of things, they understand that reusability. Sometimes in the sort of automation systems administration or DBA type world, they tend to write scripts and repaste and modify things, and they're not really getting the maximum value. So one thing that. So this is an example of how not to write a function, and I'll demonstrate that as well. But let's talk about why this is not an ideal function. The first thing is, possibly, it's not necessarily a horrible message here, but the name of the function is display-message. I didn't go to check, for instance, if display is in fact an approved verb. So maybe it is, maybe it's not that bad, but there are probably better verbs in this case just to output a message. So that's one thing. Another thing I want to talk about, but you do want to make sure the naming is right. I did not data type, though this particular function doesn't have a type around the parameter. So it's a really bad idea because then anything could come in. So I could pass numbers, strings, objects, and it could break my function. Another thing, it does not have the commandlet binding attribute, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And it uses write host, which I've read a lot of things on this, and basically the general attitude is don't use write host because it causes a lot of problems. So best idea is there are other ways to output messages, but write host tends to cause issues, so it's best to avoid it in your functions. Now, PowerShell really reminds me a lot of Python in many ways, and people are probably surprised to hear that comparison. PowerShell is not as object-oriented as Python, but it does remind me of this in a couple of ways. One of the ways it's similar is that Python is very, they call it Pythonic, and there's a mindset and a philosophy behind it. Python's #1 goal is readability. It's supposed to be really straightforward to read Python code, and that's key for maintenance. I think the driving force behind PowerShell is discoverability. The idea that you can find the command that you need, you can understand what you're doing with it. So it's kind of the readability in reverse, the readability or understandability of the PowerShell language and code, and making it consistent. So commandlet naming is really key there because the verbs have specific meanings. Add, new, there's descriptions of when they should be used. And you can see also you get a lot of helpful commandlets, so you can do get command to get a list of commands that are available. Get help will get help on functions, etc. And get verb will actually give you a list of verbs that you can use. We'll see that there's document tags we can put in a function so that when somebody does a get help, they'll automatically get your tags on it that will give it information about how to use the function and what it does. And we'll even look at the show command for an example of using a GUI. And this is the function we just saw. So this is an example of writing a function badly. #1 thing, as I mentioned, it doesn't have the prefix here. We've got write verbose, but that write verbose command, I'll step back a minute. Write verbose is supported by what's called a common parameter, and a common parameter will not work in this function because we haven't used the commandlet binding. So I'll show you that in a minute. And then we use write host, of course, which I talked about. So in order to make this function available, I would just run the script, and then I can see that it's available by doing dir function, and it's display, so I'll do that. You can see it's there. Now it was already there in this case because I think I've been testing, but the idea is that it's there, and now if I want to just call like display message, I can do it. So I can do display message, hi there, and it came back. Now common parameters, so that worked and it's fine, but one of the problems there was the message, as I mentioned, but common parameters is another issue. I should be able to say verbose, and that will never display. Message should actually be displayed. You can see it's not. It's ignoring the common parameter. It will actually ignore all the common parameters because of the way this is coded. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but I just wanted to kind of cover that. So let's talk a little bit about commandlets, naming, etc. So we have a verb-noun format. We've talked about that. Valid of approved verbs. Now nouns we have some flexibility on, and I like to put a prefix on the noun, UDF, so I can always tell my functions versus Microsoft or some other module's commandlets. So that makes it easy. So I know if there's a bug in the code and it has UDF on the function, I know I wrote it. Or maybe somebody else in the company has their initials prefixing it. So we'll see that I use UDF only on the noun side because you have flexibility on that area. So you can see here the example, invoke UDF speech. And here I've got, I'll kind of highlight some of this, but I've got something called commandlet binding, and just by putting that in, they call that an advanced function. because what it's doing is it's kind of giving you the whole world of PowerShell support at your feet with this function. It's going to bring it in, and your function now can inherit a lot of functionality directly from PowerShell, which is really great, those common parameters. And so that's all you really got to do, that one little, they call attribute. You put that in the top of your function. We have our parameters, and the param block will also give it, and I'm not convinced it's always the case, but when you use the param block, it seems to also give it the benefits of common parameters, even if you don't use command-led binding. But I always use command-led binding because I find that's always guaranteed, whereas the param, I'm not sure, will always do that. And now that we have the command-led binding, write verbose will work the way it's supposed to work. And you can see, when I talk about all these common parameters, these are all the parameters you will get support for. So there's a lot of cool stuff in here. Do my function. So this is my function I want to go over here. And I'm going to go over this. So invoke, add two numbers. Arguably not the greatest downside of this, but the main call away here is UDF. So it's my function. I'm using a valid. When I don't know what to use for verb, I usually use invoke because it seems to be okay. It's kind of generic. But here's my document tags. And when I ask for help on this function, I will get these document tags to show up. So let me clear that up. So those are what the document tags do. You can see I have my commandlet binding, and I have two parameters. And notice here I am, my number one, I've got a prefix int. So I'm telling it what type I want. This is important because if somebody passes something other than an int in, it will give them an error. So that's really good. And here are my write verbose statements. Those should only come out, only print if I pass the verbose parameter. And then here, instead of write host, I'm doing write output. But that's always going to print. We'll see that. And then I can do write information out. And then I'm just saying number equal number one plus number two. And then I'm returning the number. Some people would just do return parentheses and just add the two numbers. But I wanted to show a little more code than just that. So I put it in like that. All right, so if I run this, what it's actually going to do is define the function, because it's going to define my function for me. But notice it didn't actually output anything. But if I do dir function inv asterisk, oops, I'm going to put the colon inv asterisk, and you can see it's right there, so we know the numbers are there. Now let's take a look at like some ways of invoking it. So clear host will just kind of clear my console. And the first way I can do this, I'm just going to call it just like this with name parameters, and it will execute. So I'm highlighting and then running the green button to run that line of code. And it does the always print information, thank you, and 15. What it did not do, okay, it didn't do any of the verbose messages, okay. All right, let's, but it output this and it output this. All right, that's great. Let me pop out to the CLI for a minute. And I'm actually going to close this and come back in so I get a fresh CLI. And it ran, I have a profile script that will run, that will set things up for me. And you've got this little directory here. So what I want to do here is I want to run the function scr create function. That's the script that holds the function I just showed you. And I want to do this because I'm in a separate environment. If I say directory function inv, I don't get that function. I get a couple other ones that I've preloaded, not that one. So to get the one I want, I need to move up here so I can see this better. What I want to do is run the script. So again, let's look at the script. Now it would seem that I could just say scr create function and say ps1 and run it. Doesn't work. First rule of running scripts like this, if you haven't seen it, is .sourcing, or excuse me, is that the folder, if it's your current folder that has the scripts you want to run, you need to put period / before the script name. Then I can do this. PS1. Okay. Okay, I think I typed that wrong, so let me try this again. Create function PS1. Okay, now it ran the script, so in theory you would think our function is there. So let's see if it is. It's not there. So first rule with the period is period backslash says if I want to run a script in the current folder, that's how I can run it without having to move out of the folder and weirdly point to the folder. I find it a little bit odd. The old days in batch files, I believe if you typed in the name of a batch file in the current folder, it just ran. So it does seem a little strange to me, but that's the convention you need to use. Period backslash if it's in the folder you're currently sitting in. Okay, it did not keep this because when you run a script directly, either just giving it the full path or this period backslash, it runs the script as a fall through, but does not keep anything in it. So any objects it creates, including functions, just get discarded at the end of the execution. So if I dropped files and did things, it would actually have an effect, but it would not retain anything afterwards. To keep things, I have to put a period, a dot, then the path or name to the script. That's called dot sourcing, and the dot's telling it to keep it in memory. A little confusing in this case because I used the dot again to say I'm going to run a script in the current folder. SCR create function, and this time I'm going to use up arrow to do this. It's there, so that's the key. Dot space path to your function, and it will keep whatever that function creates in memory. All right, so now that I have it, I should be able to say invoke UDF, because it's my own function, right? Add two numbers 5 and 4, and it gives you the total at the bottom. First it does the message always print thank you, info thank you, and then the 9, so it gives you the total. Now one of the things I can do also is assign this. Ideally, when a lot of times the functions, maybe it's doing a numeric calculation or it's doing something where it returns a value, and you want to put the result of the function into a variable, and you'd say invoke UDF add two numbers 5 and 22. Okay, and enter. And notice that the info message printed out, but the result, the return statement in our function, I'll go back to that just to highlight that, returned the number. But the message always print thank you ended up in our result. And that's sort of a little feature of PowerShell that when you have code, especially functions, anything you print out is normally going to by default go into the output stream. And so even though you didn't put it in your return, it still goes back to whatever variable is going to collect it. However, let's go back for a minute and look at the function. Notice that this did not have that happen. So write information does not have that effect. So if you want to print messages and not have it end up, and you'll still want to return something as we did here, the result, you can use something like write information. Just remember to set this parameter information action to continue so that it will override the default and show the message. The default is silently continue, which won't display a message. Write output was our problem. That always shows up, so we got that. Now what about write verbose? We didn't try that yet. Let's go back and try write verbose. Will that go into our variable? What do you think? Let's see. So we'll do this again. I'll get lazy here. I'll just do this. Only this time I'm going to put the verbose parameter, right? You can see it printed out. Good chance if it printed out, it's not going to end up in a variable. And it did not. So the takeaway from this is, if you want to print messages and you also need to return values from your function to be captured, be very careful about your messages because they may get into your output stream and end up in your variable. So check that, because it can lead to some interesting bugs. I hit some weird things. I couldn't figure out what it was doing for a while when I first got into that. Verbose is my favorite choice because when you put -verbose, it displays them, and when you don't, it does not. So verbose messages are great for when you're developing lots of informational messages. The variable is this is it, good morning Brian, whatever you want for messages. And then in production, just don't put verbose as a parameter on the commandlet and you don't see them. But then if there's a bug or you need to make changes to it and you want to look at more information on it, you just put the verbose. So it's great for testing purposes. And other common parameters are things like write debug, which not only gives you a message but will allow you to interrupt the flow of your code and debug things and some things like that. So there's a cool stuff there you can do. So you've got debug, error action, output variable, out variable, warning actions, a lot of different things we can do here. Looked around a bit, but let me kind of show you what I wanted to show you, which is this. If you look at the stop process -name notepad, the idea is you're going to stop a process. That's a built-in commandlet. And you're going to stop notepad from running. The what if is actually going to just verify it's running without actually doing any damage. The out UDF careful messages function we have, we can simulate, we'll see that in a minute, that same type of functionality. And we'll also see the use of confirm. And confirm does is, before I do something, warn me about it. So let me step in here for a minute. Go back here. Let's take a look at what I mean. So conceivably, we're going to stop a process. Maybe that process is production SQL Server running on a machine, and we want to check it. Maybe we want to say, like, what is this doing? We may not. You might have somebody running something. We want to make sure what it's going to do isn't going to cause damage, because again, in here it's hard coded, but maybe this is actually a variable, and I'm not sure what the variable is holding. Something like that. So I'm going to run this, right? And what is it going to do? And let's see, I'll start Notepad so it's running. So you can see it's there. And let's just run this now. And notice it just outputs down below. Okay. Perform the operation stop process on target Notepad. So it's telling me what it's going to do. If the target was the CEO's computer, maybe not something I want to do with some of those commandlets. It will also work, like shutting off a user or logging a user off or something. Could be a number of things. If you're doing things like removing things, like remove item, deleting files, could be you're dealing with like backups of databases that are for like the last 6 months. Could be a really dangerous thing to just blow them away. So here's a way you can sort of do a what if and say, what would you do if I run it? This other one's a nice one too, and you could put this in your scripts to sort of warn people as well. The confirm is going to let you say, do you really want to do this? Stop process on target Notepad. Do I really want to do this? Could be something critical. This isn't a critical one. And if I say, yeah, it's okay, you can see it did it. So kind of a cool thing. And if you're writing, say, a function that could do damage, maybe you're doing something that's going to do a lot of cleaning up of files, move some files around, stuff like that. And before you do it, maybe you want to make sure it has that kind of thing, so you can test it and make sure before you run it. One way to get that supported is you put in this parameter within the commandlet binding, which is support should process equal true. And then the other part is you have this confirm impact equal high. Now you need both together to have this work correctly. Confirm impact is basically saying when I do things in my function, I'm escalating it to high so that it will trigger this action. The default internally for something to trigger like this event is, I believe, medium, typically in PowerShell. So high is going to say, yeah, this is important enough to trigger it. In this case, I'm not doing any parameters, and I'm going to do a write output message, which this particular commandlet doesn't need to, it's not going to trigger anything damaging, so you don't have to worry about that. Here, I'm going to, nothing damaging, but here, what am I doing? Putting a string, right, and I'm directing it. This is a way to write text to a file. So what I'm doing here is just writing this to a text file. So in theory, that could do damage. So let's see how we handle that. And then we have this block. Now what this code's designed to do is say, when you run the code, if you have the support should process turned on, and we can see we do, then warn me about this. Like basically, we'll see how it works, but it's actually going to warn me and allow me to confirm I want to continue. The idea is we're going to wrap this kind of condition around code that we consider to be risky. Like, especially maybe it's you gave a function to somebody, and one of the things it's going to do is I'm going to delete all your backup files, okay? Kind of warns them, do you really want me to do this? So at least they will be a little less angry with your function than if you didn't give them any warning at all. So let's take a look at how this works. I'm going to create my function by running it. Get the screen here. And let's kind of go down here for a minute. So the first way I want to use this, I'm going to just call it. Now, normally, you can, as we saw, we put the what if or confirm parameter. The real value of this is I'm going to get automatic support as if I passed confirm, but I'm not going to have to pass param, and I'm only going to make it execute like that selectively. So let's see what happens. I run this and it warns me. Are you sure you want to perform the action? And notice it says out UDF custom message on target, remove test file. That's the message we put in parentheses. We'll take a look in a minute. Do I really want to do that? Let's say no. And so it didn't delete anything. It didn't do anything. Now let's go up here for a minute because I want to say this is the message it printed, so we are able to pass that. So we can give ourselves a hint here to exactly what are we going to do. Prepare resume next if it's really bad, right? So in this case, we're going to do it, but now we'll pass the what if parameter. Now what if, and the really takeaway I want to show is it worked on both blocks of code because both have potential damaging consequences. But even though I didn't wrap any special code around the other one, it still worked. The what if worked because this could be potentially risky, and I used the parameter that time. But since I didn't use it the first one, it just said fine, I'm going to just do this. Okay. And finally, I'm going to run this one, which uses the confirm. Let's see what that does. First thing it's confirming is, notice it says it's going to basically be creating the file because it's saying the operation output to file on target. So that's the first one that I don't have any special code around. It's okay to do that. I'm going to say yes, so it'll create that file. The next one says, are you sure you want to perform the action? In this case, remove the test file. And I'll say yes, I'm going to let it do that. And it warns me again, I think, because I do have the code around it. And then I can take a look at this. And oops. Yeah, directory test file.txt. And it's not there. So that's the takeaway. It's not there because we allowed it to delete it. So again, we go up here, and because I did confirm, it confirmed both of these things. And that's really the takeaway, that you can control these. So what's the big takeaway? If you want to just have that command, that support for that confirmation, you can do this, and you'll be able to do all that support should process. And additionally, if you want to control certain code so that it always executes it, you've got this ability to now add custom protection code around it before you do something. So it's really handy to be able to do that. I think I've also forgot something I did want to show you on this commandlet down here, which is, oh yes, help. If I do help, I don't know if I showed this, so I'm going to run that. And help basically use those tags we entered before, so we can see the add two numbers together piece, the synopsis, etc. Those are the doc tags. And the other thing I just wanted to show is you can use the show command on our functions we write with the commandlet binding, and we can do things like, and do that, and it runs the function for us. So that's kind of a good way if you just want to get a quick and dirty GUI to people who are using your functions. You can use the show command as a way to kind of give them a quick GUI and stuff. Maybe they're not used to using the command line or something like that. Okay, so we've seen the use of stop process, what if, and confirm. And we've seen that we can get that support within our own commandlets, but we also saw functions, and we also saw that we can have custom control over those. I did want to talk about this too, because an advanced feature that you have with parameters is you have a lot of custom control over your parameters to your functions. So you can do things like mandatory equal true. There's actually a lot of these, so you can go online and take a look, but there's mandatory, which means you must pass a parameter. You can see in this string we can have a validation set. It only allows this list. Validation range, it's only going to let this number be between 20 and 65. Or you can even have code like test path, which is going to test a path like C / blah blah blah. It will actually make sure that path exists before it lets you continue. So it's got a lot of good stuff there. And that could even, that test path, that could be a function you've written to call, etc., and that could do work. So you can do all kinds of cool stuff with that. All right. So we saw this. This is where we're using the out UDF careful message to basically do that custom control around should process. And again, this pot will run and it will not remove the item unless we say yes. So it prompts us and confirms it. So it's but we need the support should process equal true and confirm impact equal high. Okay, finally, kind of going back when we were in the CLI, when we wanted to run something, we did period space and then the path of our script, and that loaded it and kept the contents of the script, what it created functions essentially afterwards. If we did not include the period, then it would not retain the function, and we'd be like, where is it? And that caused me a lot of pain when I first started, because I didn't figure out, why are my functions? I ran the script, the function should be there, and it doesn't do that. The CLI it's all in the same context, so it kind of does keep it around. But when you're in the ISE, you don't run into that problem, because you run it and it will keep it around because you're all in the same session. But the CLI works differently. It just runs the script and then comes back and gets rid of everything. It deletes it. So be careful about that. And if you want to, and the thing I find a tad confusing is using a period twice. The first period is the .sourcing. If you want to run a script in the current folder, remember period / script name. And then, so if you're going to do both, it would be period space, period / script name if you want it to keep your functions that are being created in the script. Okay, so we talked about what are PowerShell functions. We talked about why we care, which is like, this gives us a lot of reusability, productivity really is the gains, quality. We saw some things about how not to write a function. Mostly we should type define, make sure we have a type defined and any parameters going in. It's a really good idea to try to tightly define the types of your variables in general, so because then you have more control over it, and you will break if it's better to break code than to have it run incorrectly. It can be dangerous if it just lets it go, so that's why you want to do that. So we saw some of those things, making sure we follow the verb name and that the verb we use in our commandlet is in fact approved by Microsoft or whatever the community, and you get that list. We learned a lot about discoverability and things we can do to kind of leverage that, like using the get commands like get help, etc., which helps us figure out things. But we also can say get-verbs, and that gives us a list of valid verbs. But we can also use the doc things, the document tags in our functions, so that when people do get help, they can get help on our functions. And again, following that verb-now naming and sticking to the correct verbs makes it easier for people just to look at the name of your function and have a pretty good idea what it does. So we looked at how to write a function that follows the basic structure. Use something like that. Take mine off the GitHub, please, and just use that as like a template, and then do what you want with it. I have to put, caveat, disclaimers. Do not put that into production. Not authorizing it as anything and verifying it's good or bad or indifferent. So if you use it, just remember it's just as is, but feel free to use that and template it and use it for your own functions. And we did a lot of talking about gotchas. The period.sourcing can be confusing. The support should process could be confusing, because if you try to do that kind of stuff and you didn't put those in, you could get some interesting results there. So you do have to think about those. So there are some things that when you're writing this, you need to know. And the commandlet binding is key, because you won't get the common parameter support without it. All right. So I hope you've liked this presentation. Please like, share, all that good stuff. I like to get the word out to people. I've seen some great feedback on the PowerShell stuff I've done. This presentation was actually based on a comment somebody made, like, what about functions? And I've never specifically addressed, I don't think, functions as a topic. So I hope you've liked it. And till next time, thank you.